All right, so the Loop 2020s are going to come out later this month, according to Ben McPhee. And I just wanted to put together a little video kind of demonstrating on how to change your parts without totally messing up the parts of the 2020. One of the problems that we had when we were prototyping it was the axles would get really kind of chewed up. And I don't know if you can see how chewed up this axle is, especially when you compare it to a new one. Right there, you can kind of see how many marks are on that thing. The problem with this was I couldn't find a good way to remove the axle. And so after a lot of experimenting, I came across the idea and suggested using some copper on some pliers, because copper is softer than steel, so it won't mark it up. I tried everything. I tried all sorts of different rubbers, rubber bands, inner tubes. I hadn't tried any harder rubbers, but the problem was I couldn't get enough of a grip on the axle to actually pull it loose. So then I tried out the copper idea and it worked perfectly. I haven't had a marked axle since then. And so what you'll need is a pair of locking pliers. I like the locking pliers because they give you a nice firm grip. And you'll need to protect the tips with some copper. And so you can just bend the copper around the edge. It doesn't take very long to do. And then you can grip the end of the axle nice and tight and then untwist it. Now, you can either make some temporary locking pliers like those ones. I made some permanent ones with some locking pliers I got from $2 at Walmart. Just took some copper, bent it to conform to the pliers, and then I epoxied that down. I use these things all the time for changing out axles, and it cost me probably $5 to make. And so very, very useful. I'd highly recommend just throwing together a pair of these if you're able to. A couple of other tools that I use when I'm changing out parts for the 2020s. You have the hex tool, YoYoFactory's hex tool. You can either use that or the multi-tool. And then I also like to use a pair of needle nose pliers. I got these ones for pretty cheap. They're actually really sharp down here, and I'll kind of show you what I use those for as well. Now I'm going to take this 2020. I got this and it was actually set up at shoe settings. At the end of the video I'll go ahead and I'll show a bunch of different settings. The nice thing about the 2020 is there's a lot of different ways that you can set them up and have them actually work really, really well. And so shoe setting, it's a number 1 and number 2 starburst, the smallest number 3 axle, and then white spacers. He also does 4 drops of oil, thick lube, 2 on the axle and 2 in the bearing. And so that's how I had these set up. It works really nice, but the string's a little bit short for me. And so I don't use that setting a whole lot. Especially right now I'm trying to learn the shoulder wrap twist trick. And with shorter strings it just is not very easy. And so first you got to take off the bearing. It's kind of getting stuck at the end right here. That's actually the reason why I have these needle nose pliers that are kind of sharper. Again, Walmart, really cheap. If it gets stuck right there, there might be a burr, it might have mushroomed out. You can either file it down with some sort of a nail file or sandpaper or something like that. I just use these. You just take them, put them around the edge, and then just kind of rub it a little bit, kind of see if you can get off that burr, and then hopefully, if it works right, the bearing should be able to pop right off. While I'm doing this, I'm going to go ahead and just clean this bearing. Drop it in there and clean it. Now one of these sides is a 2 and one of the sides is a 3. The settings that I'm going to use right now, I'm going to switch it to, is a 2 starburst, a 3 starburst, and then a white and a red spacer with the longest axle. That's a number 1 axle. I like this setting for a longer string, like a 32-inch string, a 32-inch string. That seems to work very well for me for that setting. It may be the longest axle, but because I'm using the more aggressive starburst and spacer, it actually isn't the widest axle setting that you can get, or the widest gap setting. And so you use your non-marking pliers that you made with the copper, take those, grip the axle, and then just go ahead and pull that right out. Let's see if I can adjust it. And that was one of the problems, was getting enough grip to actually pull out the axle. While not marking the axle. So, there we go. So that's off. And again, the copper is softer than the steel, so any marks will be on the copper and not on the axle. All right, so then I'm going to use, let's see, this is a number 3. I'm going to use my number 1 axle. I'm going to share the number 2 spacer, and so that's this one. So I'm going to go ahead and put the axle on that side. Right there. I'm going to go ahead and drop the white spacer right there, the number 3 the number 2 starburst. And then white spacer. Go ahead and take out this one. I'm going to swap this 1 starburst with a 3 starburst. So I'll use the hex tool. So I take those out, take the starburst out. Now this starburst I've already used previously, and so it's been threaded previously. If it hasn't been threaded previously, if I haven't already driven screws into it, then I'm not very careful in putting the screws in. If I have, then I don't want to strip out the threads inside the starburst that I've already put in there, and I've done that before. And so the way that I do it, I've found, works really well for putting the screws back in without stripping it, as I push the screws in all the way. See, in this one, oh, that one went in too. Okay, so they're all the way in. Double check, make sure I got the number 3. Okay, and then I lightly set the starburst there. And then I'm gonna go ahead and just start screwing each of these in, not pushing in at all, just letting them kind of grab it when they will, trying to make sure that they get those same threads they got before. Then once they're all in, I go ahead and I push the starburst in all the way, and then screw those in. After they're all screwed in initially, I go around one more time just to make sure that things didn't change. So I got my one side all set up, my other side all set up. The 3, I'm going to put the red spacer with the 3, and then gotta go ahead and get my bearing. And I like to do dewdrops on the axle. The other way. There we go. All right. 2 drops of oil on the bearing. And that's it. So that's my new setup. Those are some of the suggestions that I have on how to get your settings changed without totally messing up the axle or the other parts. Remember to be careful when you're using starburst that you've already previously used. You want the screw to get those same threads to make sure it doesn't strip them out. Careful when you're removing your axle. I highly recommend using a pair of copper lined pliers, non-marking, so that you don't scratch up the axle. And so that's how I swap out my Loop 2020 settings, and there you go.